What ho chaps, I'm Magical Mike and I'd like to ask and answer a few questions about the Engineer Elite specialization at the Mechanist. Hopefully I can explain relatively quickly what it does, how it does that thing, and most importantly how it feels and if it's fun to play. And if you like the video then do please leave a like and consider subscribing. Thanks. First up, let's see what ArenaNet thinks the Mechanist is all about, and then I'll take it through some Dragon Response missions with CMs on, some strikes and some open world mobs.
No one makes friends like a Mechanist. With the power and beauty of Jade Tech, they never fight alone. They summon a customized Jade Tech battle mech to fight alongside in combat, calling the shots with powerful mech command skills and mace attacks. Whether it's melee, ranged, or group support, adapt to any situation by choosing the traits that best suit your situation. This Engineer Mech is truly the all-purpose multi-tool of any Guild Wars 2 squad.
Yep, that seems pretty spot on to me. A Jade Tech mech that can fill a variety of roles, new skills that command it to do things, signets, and the mace. They didn't mention losing tool belt skills though, so let's get into the details. The Mechanist is a pet class, pure and simple. Your entire focus is on the Jade Tech mech, as it absolutely pumps out your chosen damage types, or a ton of boons depending on your role of choice. I don't think I really need to explain why you'd pick this specialization over other engineer specs. It's the only choice if you want to run around with a superpowered mech ally, a weapon to surpass Metal Gear. First up though, we should talk about the mace. It's a bit of a hybrid weapon here, having both pretty decent condition and power damage potential in it, but also opening up some support options too. The auto attacks hit quite solidly and apply confusion, even some barrier at the end. Skill 2 is a leap that gives allies vigour, shame the mech can't dodge or make use of this boon, but everyone else can, and skill 3 is a projectile that fires a rocket fist, exploding, burning and stunning targets. Now where have I seen that before? I quite liked the mace. It's got a bit of a punch to it, and I'm not just saying that just to make a joke about the rocket fist. It's a simple weapon, but the fact is, it can do pretty much any job that you'd want it for, while still being alright at the others. Feels pretty good. It's not the star of the show, but it does allow you to pair it with a shield, or the greatest handgun ever made. You know, all these Metal Gear references are just probably going over people's heads. Excuse me. Utility skills this time are signets, so you'll get a bunch of passives from them and active abilities too. The heal signet is fairly dull, just regenerates you and the mech over time. The elite skill is almost a must-have in most situations, since it'll lower the cooldown of all your other signets, fire a huge laser from your mech if you're feeling spicy, or instantly resummon the mech if that is on cooldown. More on that in a bit. Then you have a knockback and stun break signet with a cast time, which is a little bit odd, a movement speed and shadow step signet, which was fairly clunky to use with the AI pathfinding, a condition field that follows you or the mech, or a signet that pulses a ton of barrier and blocks projectiles, which is pretty damn strong actually. These were all mostly just alright. Signets are typically one of the most memed skill types in Guild Wars 2 because they are usually decent to ignore and keep as passive buffs, meaning they're often considered low skill cap abilities. The animations ranged from nothing to pretty cool, with Jade Laser and Poisonous Domes being relatively up there, but overall they're a totally safe choice. Core engineer utility skills aren't personally my favourite skills in the game. I like scrapper gyros mostly and elixirs for their variety of applications, but since we don't have a tool belt anymore, a ton of engineer utilities lose a lot of important skills, essentially making signets an overall safe pick to fill your slots with, though you might consider them boring if you like playing with kits and pressing a million buttons. Now then, the mech. Kept you waiting, huh? Alright, just one more reference. Your mech can be renamed like a pet, which is obviously the most important thing to say first. It's also an AI companion that can be customised with abilities and stats too, using your traits. If you played a ranger at all, you'll recognise the pet UI here. You can tell it to use 3 different skills, call it back to you, and decide if it's passive or aggressive. No simple attack by target command though, which might be an oversight. Surprisingly, there's not a whole lot to say about the mech itself, despite it being the whole class fantasy. It does its job, and whatever you pick for that job is what it will do. It has a break bar to resist some crowd control, a massive amount of health, ranged and melee options, it can generate boons and do some pretty consistently decent damage, and even offer its own crowd control on top of all of that. The only issues it has are pathing and your typical AI decision making that happens throughout the game. For example, it can't jump, so it could be kited fairly easily in PvP, but then that's why you'd pick the ranged option. It might also make some very odd decisions that send it 10 miles away, or fire its projectiles at walls, or miss entirely with the slower moving ones. It would be nice to have some feedback on commanding the mech to use its skills though. Using one and then waiting for it to get into range before it fires leaves a commonly occurring few moments of, well, are you going to do it or not? I'm not quite sure if the mech is listening to me, while you wait and see. Having a mech also overwrites your tool belt, meaning no access to grenade barrage, big ol' bomb or other favourites from the Engie kit. It kind of kills HGH as a trait since it halves your elixir skill access also, and these points about the lack of tool belt are where I felt the most lacking whilst playing a Mechanist. We could also mention underwater here when talking about lacking, because the mech simply doesn't exist underwater. You get a depth charge skill and that's it. That is a huge loss of function if you decide to go swimming. Onto traits, the whole kit is about augmenting the mech. It inherits a ton of stats from you based on your choices, ranged or melee attacks, and can change its overall focus based on your loadout picks for it. Adept traits affect its first skill, Master its second, and GM its third. It also gets 2 skills it can use on its own, which can sort of interrupt its own flow sometimes too. You can choose to make the mech a power bot, condi bot, or a boon support bot. You can also mix those if you want to. The first choice also visually changes its arms too. Shame the others don't. Overall, the traits are pretty straightforward. I mean, literally, if you want power, you pick all of the bottom traits. If you want condi, you pick all of the top, and if you want boons, you pick all of the middle. Personally, while I loved the adept power trait to make it ranged and give its F1 an enormous burst of damage on a short cooldown, I found I just couldn't generate very much might without picking the boon trait in the adept slot. In a group though, that isn't a problem. The mech skills themselves were mostly alright. They do a lot of damage and pulse a lot of boons if you pick the boon options, so if you care about that, then don't worry about it. But if you just wanted cool animations and visual feedback, then a lot of these skills feel minimal or similarly basic to each other. Jade pulse blasts, slow ones, fast ones, boil 'em, mash 'em, put 'em in a stew, all of the ranged attacks were pretty similar, but at least watching it bash stuff in melee is pretty fun. There are a few interesting trait picks. One allows the mech to inherit on-hit explosive traits, meaning that you can heal it or cause bleeds with it, or aim-assisted rockets. That was quite fun to use. One GM allows signets to retain their passives on cooldown, making the re-summon signet and the heal signets super good. I mean, even the barrier signet too. And finally, one allows you to pulse alacrity to everyone that you apply barrier to, making your mace auto attacks permanently reduce cooldowns for everyone. Nice. Build-wise, I came up with 3 overall ideas, none of which should be surprising based on what I've said already. My power build very simply just picked all of the power traits and improved signets. I took Juggernaut and the might-generating auto-attacking melee mech, as well as a flamethrower to bump out maximum might, which the mech can also inherit, and some stability too. I grabbed grenades for a ranged option since we don't have weapon swap as an Engie, Mason Shield for a leap, and a blast finisher for the flamethrower's fire field, and the build basically plays itself. Just swap out a couple of traits in a group situation, because you don't need might generation and you can use the ultra-powered machine gun mech instead. The Condi build is pretty similar too, this time picking all the Condi traits, inheriting shrapnel from explosives, and using a bomb kit for more fire, confusion, and even a smoke bomb for stealth if you may sleep through it. I also tried supporting the mech with double pistols or a shield and it all just works fine. Condi mech seems about as powerful to me in solo situations as power mech does, so it does seem like preference to me. And finally I built a support build that spams so many boons that you'll be rolling in them. Perma alacrity with mace autos, barrier, vigour, might, protection, regen, swiftness, so many boons, and tons of condition cleanse too with the elixir gun and various traits. I didn't actually play this one, but I saw some mechanists running similar things and it was dumping so much stuff that it's very obvious that it is a strong support. In the open world I basically ran around feeling like I could take on anything. The mech can have pathfinding issues and can occasionally do stupid stuff, which is compounded by not having the attack and return pet controls properly available, but most of the time it just worked. And boy did it work. The Jinn, while always extremely dangerous, kinda just melt while the mech does its thing. If you've got CC abilities on the mech, spamming those will cleave through break bars, and if you don't, then you can just slot some yourself. I had Flamethrower 3, Shield 4 and 5, and Mace 3 all deleting those break bars easily. And while you won't have big ol' bomb to help with that on a Condi build, You do have a lot of conditions that tick regardless, and a stealth bomb if you get into trouble. Both types of damaging build did well, and the mech does so much damage on its own that I'm pretty sure you could just run around uselessly and have it do all of the work regardless. I did see its brake bar get wrecked by Hydra meteors, and it does stand inside AoE damage until it dies quite stupidly, so the Jin dashes could insta-kill it in some situations, but overall the thing is really strong, and it'll mostly stand up to a lot of punishment. When the mech does die though, you will feel it. It has an insane cooldown when it isn't around to resummon, making the alacrity trait that much more valuable, but also making the engineer extremely weak feeling without its mech. If your mech dies, you're literally down to 2 out of 3 usable trait lines, and you're missing tool belt skills on top of that too. It's really bad feeling. Luckily, you can just insta-resummon it if you have the elite signet slotted, but if your mech does something stupid again, you'll be hurting for those cooldowns. Not great. The mech was basically able to deal with the CM DRMs that I put it up against no problem. These were the only times it actually died during important, long fights though. Yeah, as I said, the Jin got some kills, but DRM bosses with their tons of AoE and damage fields that it can't avoid managed to consistently stun the mech and then punish it. On the power build, I was able to simply spam the heal signet to keep it going longer and do enough damage to phase things as my signet fixed it up though. The support variant would be inherently much tankier though, and much less likely to die, so if you're worried about that, just play a tanky build. In strikes and group content, the mech kind of shines. It'll get a ton of useful boons just by default passively being around any kind of other support players, and I don't think it ever even took much damage while I was playing against these bosses. Both Condi and Power were fun to play, but the Power one with its machine gun lasers was my favourite variant. Though anyone who played it as a support told me that it was loads of fun too, and after seeing various videos, I have to agree, it does look very good, despite the awkward pathing in some cases. The Mechanist is just effective. It's a very simple class to play. Essentially all you have to do is make sure that you spam F1, F2 and F3, and you'll get loads of mileage out of just how much damage this thing can do. And that's without using any of your other skills. If you want to actually do other things, you'll be even more effective of course. If you do nothing but passively equip signets and just use those 3 F skills, it'll do just fine. And that's okay. It's not the most complex thing to play if you don't want it to be, having a very low skill floor because the AI basically does everything for you. But it does offer some skill cap if you want to use combo fields, some awkward positioning control, and that one evade skill that you can give the mech, along with tactically using its crowd control skills to break bars at the right times if you have them slotted. The Mechanist is easy to play, and the game has room for a very easy class, so it is actually welcome, despite what some people might tell you. It just happens to be an elite spec on one of the most complicated to play core classes. Ultimately the question is this: do you want to play the game as a pet class with a mech? If you answered yes, the Mechanist is your pick.
Kill them all!